Welcome back to another Fireside chat. Today's topic is, I think, a rather interesting topic. It's actually one of the hot topics right now concerning autism, and it is whether or not the diagnosis of autism should be split into separate diagnoses, with one for profound autism and one for, I guess, what we'll call non-profound autism. So I want to talk about this. We know that autism is nothing more than a developmental difference that happens early enough in life that it impacts communication and sensory processing. That's basically what autism is. It can be caused by a lot of different things. That's one of the reasons why we don't know all the things that cause autism, because a lot of things can cause the symptoms that we see as autism. So it makes for a pretty big category. So I can see why people would suggest dividing autism into separate categories, because there's a pretty relatively large percentage of the population that has autism. So, that said, I don't think it makes sense to divide autism into profound versus non-profound autism, because it means dividing autism diagnoses by functioning. That has already been done with the addition of the autism levels to the DSM-5. And it doesn't really work as a separate diagnosis because functioning changes depending on the environment throughout the lifetime. We don't make diagnoses based on environmental differences that change throughout the lifespan because, one, it's not practical to have a diagnosis that must be changed based on differences in the environment. It's just not practical. And two, we generally do not make psychological diagnoses for things that are environmental, because that would be more of a diagnosis of an environment rather than a person. But it is true that autism is a large umbrella category that needs to be better defined, as I cannot think of any other diagnosis that is so broad and has such a high percentage of people affected. So how should we go about that? That's the question. We need to think about the purpose and benefit of splitting the autism diagnosis, as well as the consequences. The primary consequence is that if we divide autism up into different diagnoses, then we will have to start the fight for treatment coverage all over again. And we do obviously have people who do not appear to be significantly affected, who are at significantly increased risk of dying by suicide due to lack of appropriate support. So even though we have some that do not need as obvious of support for the entire span of the lifetime, we do still have people who end up needing additional supports to protect and preserve their life. So I would call that affected. On the other hand, the benefit and purpose in creating a diagnosis in the first place is to make it easier to identify the most effective treatment options. That's why we diagnose people. It's not so that we can put everybody in a box. It's so that we can figure out what is most likely to help. Psychology is a bit of a soft science. We do research, but it's a little different when you're doing research with people. And so because of that, when we do research with people, we cannot be quite as certain about what might be an issue. And that can be a real challenge. As it is a soft science, there's limitations. That's what I'm trying to get at, is that we have limitations, but that doesn't mean that there aren't significant issues. So at any rate, the benefit and purpose in creating a diagnosis in the first place is to make it easier to identify the most effective treatment options. The best example I can think of comes from a Star Trek episode. I know you're shocked. But there's an episode in season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation where Dr. Pulaski loses power to the entire sick bay, and someone breaks their leg and they're like, the knitter is broken, what do we do? Like, the knitter doesn't have power, what do we do? And she's like, take 2 boards and wrap them to the leg and make a splint. And they're like, a splint? That's not practicing medicine. And she's like, sure it is. It's a time-honored way of using your heart and your hands. Now hop 2. And really, if you think about it, that's what psychology is all about. It's about using our heart and our hands to hop 2 when we don't have enough knowledge about what's actually happening in the brain to know what to do. So we create lists of symptoms, and those lists of symptoms we then take and go, okay, well, with these symptoms, these treatments are more likely to be effective. So it really is a bit of a guessing game, okay? But if we want to improve our ability to identify appropriate treatment for autism, the key would be to divide autism diagnoses by what causes each case of autism, as that will give us more practical help in identifying appropriate treatment. Problem being, and now you see why autism is such a large and broad category, because we still cannot say definitively what causes autism, but we do know some of the things that cause autism. One of the things we know that can cause autism is certain genetic mutations. We also know that people with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome experience changes in their brain structure and have a significantly increased chance of being autistic by like an increase of 640% more chance of being autistic. So these different possibilities alone need different kinds of supports. Yes, they all benefit from speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, etc. Those are just general developmental supports. But where it gets more specific is in the medical supports required by children with specific genetic mutations or connective tissue diseases, and what works for one condition does not work for all conditions. And sometimes you can even have variety within conditions. And we can apply this logic to other psychological diagnoses like specific learning disability in reading, or more commonly known as dyslexia. If we understand what is causing the problem with reading, whether it's vision, visual processing, working memory, etc., then we can better support learning and development. The problem is that years ago, when the DSM was first devised, it was devised by an autistic person when we had very limited knowledge of the brain. Since that time, we have tried to keep the DSM up to date, but it has become harder and harder to simply update the DSM with all of the new knowledge we are gaining about the brain. I suspect eventually it will take another autistic person coming along and creating a brand new diagnostic system that takes into account all of the knowledge that we are gaining, rather than just symptoms. They'll be looking at what's causing things and mapping it out that way. So we are not there yet scientifically, but we're getting closer and closer. And until that time, the current system is the best we have to work with. In the meantime, it means that we have a broader range of abilities within autism as a diagnostic category, which I think in some ways can be helpful, because it means that we have that broader range of abilities, which can be very helpful as far as advocacy work goes. So I think that's of benefit. But eventually, we have to break down diagnoses based on cause. What's happening in the brain that's causing these things? Because many things can cause you to experience symptoms of dyslexia. Many things can cause you to experience symptoms of autism. And it is only in understanding what those causes are that we can provide the best treatment possible. But like I said, the DSM was created by an autistic individual years ago, before we had all of the knowledge that we have of the brain now. And I think it will eventually take another autistic person who's really good at patterns and like organizing chaotic mess of information into a clear-cut organizational plan to create a new diagnostic criteria that takes cause into account. And I really think that's really the only way that you can effectively divide up the autism diagnosis in a way that makes sense. And that's the thing. It has to make sense. There has to be a reason that we are dividing up the diagnosis. Like, what's the benefit? One of the things that people have been talking about with the idea of dividing it up with profound autism versus, I guess, unprofound autism is the idea that there are services being taken away from people who have profound autism. I don't think that's actually the case. I think that a lot of people with profound autism need, whatever we call it, need significant supports throughout the lifespan. And a lot of times by the time you graduate high school, a lot of those resources dry up because not everybody needs them, and so there's perhaps less advocacy work being done to address those situations. But I don't think it's that services are being taken away from others. We don't have enough supports as it is. Like, that's already the case. We have significantly higher rates of suicide among autistics. We have significantly higher rates of accidental death because of those things, as well as the significantly increased rate of autoimmune conditions and poor health care for autistics, because people don't take into account the fact that our brains are different, therefore our bodies are wired up a little differently. Because of all of those things, the average lifespan for an autistic person is 36 years old. It's not that all of us live to 36 and then die. It's that a lot of us are being taken out by a lot of these risk factors. And the only way we get rid of those risk factors that are taking so many of us out is to improve support options. And we got a long ways to go. We've come a long ways, but we have still got a long ways to go. And I think it's going to require all hands on deck to make that happen. It means also a lot of effort on all of our parts. Autistic people, non-autistic people, parents of autistic people, all working together to try to communicate well, to try and listen to different people's lived experiences, and to try to figure out how can we support these people best, like whoever it is. How can we make supports better? You know, how can we change the significantly higher rates of bullying in schools for neurodivergent children? That shouldn't be a thing, you know? How can we decrease the significantly higher rate of suicide among autistic teenagers? You know, how can we improve health care for autistic people whose health is not, whose physiological differences are not being taken into account? These are all problems that we need to address, and dividing up a diagnosis by functioning won't solve those problems. But if we work together, we could make a big dent in it. But a lot of what's stopping us isn't the diagnoses. I think it is when we choose not to listen to each other, to our different experiences, when we become satisfied with the status quo, when we become satisfied with, well, yeah, I mean, kids that are autistic just have a higher incidence of suicide when they're teenagers. I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. So let's do something about it. So that is some of my thoughts on whether or not we should divide up autism into multiple diagnoses. Eventually, one day, I think it needs to happen. But I think it needs to be done by cause. And we just don't have enough information right now. So until we have more information, I think the best we can do is to continue to communicate and listen to each other and do our best to support each other in trying to advocate for better support services and re-envision our world into a place that naturally provides better supports and better outcomes for autistics everywhere. So thanks for joining me today. Feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. Be very curious to hear what people's thoughts are on this.